Hello, and welcome to Mind Sherlock, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Today, I bring you a brand new Sherlock Holmes mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable, and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in from. Now, let's get started. It was on a bleak and cheerless morning in late November that this curious case first announced itself, though I could hardly have guessed at the time how deeply it would entangle us. A pall of London fog clung to the window panes of 221B Baker Street, muting the feeble daylight into something ghostly and grey. Even our roaring fire could not dispel the gloom. Holmes was in one of his more dangerous moods, the peculiar condition I had come to recognize as the byproduct of prolonged inactivity. His lean form sprawled languidly across the settee, his dressing gown loose about him, his eyes hooded with thought. In his hand, his long fingers twirled his unlit pipe with restless precision, while the table beside him bore evidence of recent chemical experimentation. A sight that rarely boded well for the peace of our lodgings. A vile chemical smoke curled in heavy tendrils from a set of scorched glass beakers, coating the room in an acrid haze. I coughed into my handkerchief and crossed to throw open the window, only to be rewarded by an invasion of icy fog from the street below. Holmes, for the sake of my lungs, if not your own, might we seek air of a purer variety, I suggested, though I knew such appeals were rarely heeded. Holmes, however, merely raised a brow, his expression bordering on amusement. The air, my dear Watson, will soon bring itself to us. Even as he spoke, there came a measured knock upon the door, too soft for urgency, too deliberate for hesitation. Mrs. Hudson, ever prompt in her duties, opened the door below, and I heard her voice falter. A moment later, she stood at the threshold, her colour somewhat paler than usual. "A visitor for you, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice a shade too formal. They would not give a name." Holmes's gaze sharpened instantly, and with a languid gesture, he waved the unknown caller in. "Interesting," he murmured. "I do enjoy guests who prefer to arrive anonymously." The figure stepped forward, cloaked head to toe in black, a hood pulled low enough to obscure their face entirely. Yet Holmes barely afforded them a glance. His eyes, instead, swept over their gloves, their damp hem, and the faintest smear of foreign clay clinging to their boot. "From St. James's Square," he announced casually. "Your cloak purchased in Paris, though the fit suggests it was tailored for a taller man. You attended a murder last night, not as a participant, but as a silent witness. And yet, you have told no one." The figure recoiled slightly, though no words passed their lips. Mrs. Hudson gasped aloud, while I, accustomed as I was to these performances, could not entirely suppress my own astonishment. "You see, Watson," Holmes said lightly, "some clients come to us wearing their secrets like jewellery, dazzling but impossible to miss." I had witnessed Holmes unravel many a client's hidden truth before a single word was spoken, but there was something unsettling about this encounter. Perhaps it was the silence of the visitor, or the faint tremor of their gloved hand, barely perceptible beneath the heavy cloak. Even Holmes, for all his detachment, seemed intrigued, not by the figure alone, but by the weight of fear they carried into our sitting room. "This," he murmured, almost to himself, "will be no ordinary case, Watson. I dare say it may prove to be something altogether more personal." And with that, the game began. The figure raised her hands to the edge of her hood, hesitating only briefly before lowering it to her shoulders. Lady Evelyn Rathbone stood before us, a name I had not heard in some years, but one which had once commanded attention in the more fashionable circles of London society. There was a faded elegance about her, like a portrait left too long in the sun. Her face, though still striking, bore the unmistakable marks of anxiety and exhaustion. The sharpness in her cheekbones owed less to aristocratic breeding than to nights spent sleepless and afraid. Holmes inclined his head slightly, his keen gaze darting from her boots to her fingertips and back again. I could feel the machinery of his mind already in motion, assembling facts from fragments, constructing her story before she could even begin. "Pray, be seated, Lady Evelyn," said Holmes, "and do not trouble yourself with unnecessary embellishment. I assure you, the facts will suffice." "My brother is gone," Lady Evelyn began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He vanished last night after receiving a letter signed by a name I had hoped never to hear again, the silent executioner." I glanced at Holmes, expecting some flicker of recognition, but his expression remained impassive. Yet there was, if I knew my friend at all, a subtle shift in his posture, a tightening of the fingertips upon his steepled hands, a brief narrowing of the eyes. This name, unfamiliar to me, had piqued his curiosity. "An evocative title," Holmes remarked lightly, "and no doubt chosen for theatrical effect. Tell me, Lady Evelyn, what crime does this executioner claim your brother has committed?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and I could see that her answer would not come easily. He was accused of a betrayal," she said at last. "Something that happened 20 years ago in Paris." Even before she explained further, the story began to take shape in my mind. I had vague recollections of a scandal involving the Rathbone family, whispered about in those days when such things still made their way into the gossip columns. Felix Rathbone had been a restless spirit, known for his gambling debts and reckless affairs. Lady Evelyn described how, earlier that evening, Felix had received a letter delivered by hand. No postage mark, no indication of its source. It contained only the executioner's signature, a demand for a midnight meeting, and a chilling promise that Felix would pay for his sins in silence. "I followed him," she admitted. "He would not tell me the truth, but I could not let him go alone. I watched from the shadows, and now my brother is gone." Holmes had leaned forward slightly, his interest sharpening with every word. Lady Evelyn's voice faltered as she described what she saw. "It was foggy, so thick I could barely see the ground beneath my feet. I followed Felix to a small clearing near the docks, where a figure stood waiting." "What figure?" asked Holmes, his voice low. "A man, or perhaps a woman, cloaked and masked." They spoke only a few words before Felix seemed to stagger backwards. No gunshot, no blade. He collapsed without a cry, as though life itself had simply been snatched from him. I exchanged a glance with Holmes, who tapped his fingers together thoughtfully. "And the body?" he asked. "Gone," said Evelyn. "By the time I reached him, there was nothing, no trace. It was as if the fog had swallowed them both." Holmes gave a soft hum of interest, the kind I had come to recognize, not skepticism, but fascination. "And you saw no weapon at all?" Holmes pressed. "Nothing," she said firmly. "No blood, no wound. He simply died." Holmes lapsed into silence, his eyes half closed, fingers steepled beneath his chin. This was not his usual stillness. I could sense the puzzle already irritating him, the gaps and impossibilities forming knots in his otherwise logical mind. A murder without a weapon, without a sound, and without a body, Holmes mused at last. That is, I confess, a most original achievement. Lady Evelyn flinched at the word murder, but Holmes paid her no heed. "Watson," he said, "there are 3 explanations for an event of this nature, and all of them are improbable. We shall therefore begin with the facts." Holmes's gaze swept over Lady Evelyn once more, this time with surgical precision. "Your gloves are new," he remarked. "Purchased hastily, I presume, after your previous pair was stained during last night's escapade." Evelyn's lips parted, but Holmes continued before she could reply. "You wear a particular perfume, rare, imported, and favoured exclusively by the performers of Le Théâtre des Illusions in Paris." An unusual choice for a lady who claims to have long severed ties with the theatrical world. Finally, he leaned closer, plucking a stray ink stain from her sleeve. "And this," he said softly, "tells me that before you came here, you either wrote or destroyed a letter of great personal significance. But we shall leave that matter for later, shall we?" Lady Evelyn sat in silence, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. I knew that expression, the look of one who realizes they are already caught, even before the game has begun. "There is more you have not told us," Holmes said gently, though his eyes remained merciless. "Whether to protect yourself, your brother, or someone whose name you cannot bear to speak, I cannot yet say." Evelyn said nothing. "No matter," Holmes went on. "I have always found that the truth, like a bloodstain on a silk glove, has a way of revealing itself in time." I had half expected him to refuse the case entirely. Holmes was not fond of half-truths or reluctant clients. Yet to my surprise, he stood and extended a hand to our guest. "Lady Evelyn," he said, "I shall undertake this matter, not because you have told me the truth, but because you have not. There is a far greater story hidden beneath this one, and it would be a crime indeed to leave it untold." With that, the client dismissed. Holmes turned to me. "Come, Watson. We have fog to walk through and ghosts to chase." It was at Holmes' insistence that I presented myself at Lady Evelyn's residence the following morning. My friend declared that his own presence would provoke too much caution from the household staff, whereas I, being less formidable in reputation, might draw forth unguarded confidences. The house, though still bearing the weight of its former grandeur, had the unmistakable air of a family in retreat from society. The butler, a man of excessive dignity, received me with evident suspicion and only reluctantly ushered me into the morning room, where the senior servants had been assembled at Lady Evelyn's command. What followed was a tangle of contradictions. Mrs. Greaves, the housekeeper, spoke of Felix Rathbone with teary-eyed fondness, painting him as a reformed soul, a man who had learned the bitter lessons of youth and sought only quiet redemption. By contrast, the footman, a sharp-featured fellow of indeterminate age, offered dark whispers of gambling debts, midnight visitors, and rooms locked against even the household staff. It was the cook, a stout woman with arms like rolling pins, who let slip a telling detail. Felix had, more than once, received letters from Paris, though the envelopes were burned immediately after reading. I jotted down these discrepant accounts with growing frustration. Holmes had often said that the truth, when buried in a garden of gossip, was a weed that could only be revealed by pulling up every root. Armed with this patchwork of stories, I made my return to Baker Street, where Holmes had naturally been far busier than myself. I found Holmes bent over a small writing desk in Felix Rathbone's private study, his sharp features illuminated by the pale morning light filtering through half-drawn curtains. He barely acknowledged my arrival, save for a lifted hand to silence my intended report. "I have been listening to the study speak," Holmes remarked without preamble, his fingers gliding over the desk's polished surface. "It is astonishing what a man confesses to his writing table when no one else can hear." He drew my attention to a scattering of fine sea salt, barely perceptible, clinging to the inner lip of a drawer. "Felix had packed for departure," Holmes said softly, "though not by railway or carriage. This is the mark of a man bound for a ship's cabin." Next, Holmes extracted a half-finished letter, the ink still faintly smudged, where a hurried hand had folded it prematurely. It spoke in cryptic terms of debts finally settled and a shadow from the past now lifting. But it was the final discovery that arrested even Holmes's usual composure. Peeling back the lining of the top drawer, he revealed a photograph, inverted and carefully hidden. The portrait of a young woman, her eyes bold, her expression defiant. Holmes stared at the image for a moment too long, then slipped it silently into his pocket. "The sea salt, the letter, and this," he said quietly. "Felix was not merely fleeing danger. He was fleeing her. I have seen Holmes react to 1,000 pieces of evidence, but rarely have I seen him withhold the meaning of a clue so deliberately. His fingers closed around the photograph with a gentleness I would scarcely have believed him capable of. "You know her," I said at last. "Perhaps," Holmes replied, his gaze fixed on the window. "But knowledge is not certainty, Watson, and certainty is the only currency worth spending. The woman in the photograph was beautiful, no doubt, but hers was a beauty sharpened by experience. Not the untroubled prettiness of a society girl, but the face of someone who had played dangerous games and survived them." "French, undoubtedly," I observed, noting the style of her gown. "Parisian," Holmes corrected. "A woman of the theatre, if my memory serves. And if she is who I suspect, then Lady Evelyn has omitted certain critical details." There was a pause, in which Holmes's fingers tapped out some internal rhythm upon the desk. "Come, Watson," he said at last. "The next step is clear." "And what is that?" "We shall make a call upon an old acquaintance, one who knows more about silent executions than Lady Evelyn has dared to admit." Without explanation, Holmes summoned a cab and directed the driver into the oldest, narrowest alleys south of Fleet Street, where the gas lamps barely penetrated the mist. "We are calling upon a club," he remarked, "though I suspect neither of us shall be made members." The carriage halted before an unmarked door, weathered and warped with age. "This," Holmes said, "is the Obsidian Circle, a refuge for men whose grievances exceed the patience of the courts." I glanced up at the crooked lintel. "A duelling club?" "Of sorts," Holmes replied. "But here, honor is rarely satisfied by conventional means. Revenge, Watson, is a more creative sport in such places." I confess I hesitated at the threshold, but Holmes pressed forward, rapping a peculiar rhythm on the door. 3 sharp knocks, followed by 2 slower. A slit opened, revealing a pair of suspicious eyes, and for a moment it seemed we would be turned away. Then, with a reluctant creak, the door swung inward. "We shall tread lightly," Holmes murmured, stepping into the gloom. "For here, every man harbours at least one deadly secret, and some are more tightly guarded than others." A brute of a man, broad-shouldered and scarred, barred our path with an outstretched arm. "Members only," he growled. "Curious," said Holmes, tilting his head. "For a man once known as Bartholomew Barker Jones, who abandoned a wife in Bristol and took flight to avoid prosecution for embezzlement, one would think he might hesitate to invoke rules so strictly." The bouncer's face blanched, his hand falling limply to his side. "Shall I enumerate the details?" Holmes continued. "The tattoo, half obscured, tells me you served in the Merchant Navy. Dismissed for theft, unless I miss my mark. The scar above your eye is not a dueling wound, but the result of a dockside altercation over stolen brandy. And your right boot, why, it still bears the mark of the distinctive cobbler who once supplied uniforms to the Bristol Constabulary. Shall I go on?" The man stepped aside without another word. Holmes turned to me with a faint smile. "You see, Watson? Sometimes membership is granted by memory alone, and with that, we pass through the door, leaving the stunned doorman to consider the price of his past." The air within was thick with smoke and silence, save for the occasional murmured wager or clink of glass. Men gathered at small tables, speaking in hushed tones, each glancing toward the entrance with wary eyes. Holmes seated himself without invitation at the nearest table, where a gaunt man with a patch over one eye seemed determined to avoid our gaze. "The silent executioner," Holmes said softly. The man's head jerked up. "I know no such name," he protested. Holmes only smiled. "You do, of course. A whisper that curls through this club like smoke. A figure who kills not by blade or bullet, but by air itself. Silent, unseen, and untraceable." The man's fingers twitched against the table's edge. "He leaves no mark," he muttered. "They say men fall dead where they stand and there's no wound to find." "Fear," said Holmes, "is its own weapon, The man crossed himself, though his trembling hand made the gesture incomplete. "If you know what's wise, sir, you'll forget that name. Men who speak of the executioner too loudly." Holmes stood, his expression unreadable. "Fear is contagious, Watson," he said. "But so is curiosity." As we stepped back into the fog-bound street, Holmes's stride slowed almost imperceptibly. A man approached from the far end of the alley, tall, his overcoat drawn tight, his hat pulled low. Holmes did not speak, nor did the stranger, yet as they passed one another, I saw a flicker of recognition in both pairs of eyes, not friendly, nor openly hostile, but the cold acknowledgement of old adversaries reunited by fate. "Who was that?" I whispered, but Holmes merely shook his head. "A man with an exceptional talent for concealment," he said. "Once, I thought him a footnote in my career. It seems I was mistaken." I could not press him further, for Holmes was already striding ahead, but the tension in his posture, the faint crease between his brows, told me that whoever that man had been, his presence had complicated this case considerably. "Watson," Holmes called over his shoulder, "when a ghost from one's past reappears on a foggy night, it is wise to assume the ghost did not come alone." I followed without further question, knowing that whatever had just passed between them was a story Holmes was not yet ready to tell. Holmes had spoken very little during our return to Baker Street, his mind clearly preoccupied by the man we had encountered outside the club and the significance of the hidden photograph. It was not until we were seated once more at his cluttered table, his long fingers tenting beneath his chin, that he abruptly spoke. "Watson, have you ever heard of Remy Leclerc, known in certain artistic circles as the magician who never touched the stage?" The name meant nothing to me, but Holmes's eyes, bright with intellectual fire, suggested it was no minor discovery. "In the years before the Franco-Prussian War," he continued, "Leclerc revolutionized the theatrical arts of illusion. Where others relied on wires, mirrors, and smoke, Leclerc employed chemistry, a mastery so refined that invisible vapors could produce effects which no magician's hand could match." "And Felix knew him?" I asked. "Not merely knew him," said Holmes. "Felix Rathbone was part of his troupe, briefly, disastrously, and with consequences that forced Felix to flee Paris under circumstances that, until now, had been conveniently forgotten." The corners of Holmes's mouth curled in that familiar smile, half amusement, half satisfaction. "And now," he added softly, "the magician who never touched the stage has reached across the channel and touched Felix Rathbone with a hand no one could see." That afternoon, Holmes ordered me to accompany him to a private reading room at the British Library, where he had prearranged access to certain volumes no longer considered suitable for general lending. "What we seek, Watson, is scandal," he said bluntly, "for scandal leaves deeper traces than respectability ever could." With the systematic precision of a man working through an intricate cipher, Holmes directed me to scour the London Gazette, the Parisian Courier, and a series of private club records, all dated 2 decades prior. At first, the trail was frustratingly faint. A whisper of a duel at the Jardin des Plantes, a ruined reputation hinted at in a gossip column. But then, in a faded issue of a minor theatrical newsletter, Holmes struck gold. "The duel was no matter of honour," Holmes read aloud. "It was a performance, devised by Leclerc himself, a contest not of swords, but of cleverness and cruelty. Each man was to expose the other's secrets publicly until one yielded from shame alone. And Felix lost. More than lost," said Holmes, his voice sharpening. "He betrayed someone in the process. Someone whose name, I dare say, we shall find attached to that photograph." He closed the book with a decisive snap. "Come, Watson," said Holmes, rising to his feet. "We have a ghost to exhume." It was well past midnight when Holmes finally illuminated the full scope of the scheme, his voice calm, his logic relentless, as he paced the room with the restless energy of a violinist awaiting his cue. "Consider, Watson," he began, "what makes a murder impossible. Remove the weapon, the case weakens. Remove the witness, weaker still. But remove the very method of death itself, and you transform the act into a phantasm, a mere figment that no court could ever prosecute. I watched as he gathered a small vial from his shelf, a sample from his private collection of exotic poisons. Leclerc, in his final years, perfected a vaporous toxin, colourless, weightless, and fatal at concentrations no greater than a whiff of perfume. He held the vial beneath my nose, though the glass remained firmly sealed. The true innovation, Holmes continued, was delivery. The toxin could be released from the sleeve with a mere flick of the wrist, as effortless as a stage magician's flourish, leaving nothing behind but silence and death. And you believe Leclerc gave this secret to the executioner? Not gave, Watson, said Holmes. Sold, or had it stolen from him by someone who once shared his stage. I felt a chill pass through me as the implications settled. A murder that leaves no mark, I murmured. Precisely, said Holmes. The executioner was not merely killing Felix. They were recreating the duel, turning Felix's final moments into a performance worthy of Le Théâtre des Illusions itself. He turned back to the fire, his face illuminated by flickering light. Now, said Holmes, we have our method. All that remains is to uncover the hand beneath the glove. Holmes wasted no time. Within an hour of our return to Baker Street, Lady Evelyn was seated once more before him, her gloved hands clenched tightly in her lap. Holmes stood at the hearth, his gaze fixed upon her with a clinical detachment that I knew too well. Your brother's predicament, Lady Evelyn, he began, is not the result of mere bad fortune. It is the consequence of a history you have chosen not to reveal, one in which you, not Felix, play the leading role. Evelyn's lips parted, but Holmes raised a finger. There is no point in denial. The photograph concealed in Felix's desk, the scent of Parisian theatre perfume still clinging to your cloak, and your refusal to name the executioner. These are not the omissions of a concerned sister. They are the evasions of a woman hiding her own past. Her breath caught. What do you mean? I mean, Holmes said quietly, that the executioner was once your lover, Lady Evelyn, a man you betrayed, abandoned, and sought to forget. He has not returned for Felix alone. He has returned for you. Evelyn's composure collapsed. She covered her face with trembling hands, and through her fingers came a whisper. Remy. Holmes allowed her a moment of silence before speaking again. Now, Lady Evelyn, for your brother's sake, if not your own, you will tell me the whole truth. Evelyn spoke in fits and starts, her words weighed down by memory. Years before, in the heady days of her youth, she had been the toast of Paris, a glittering figure in society who found herself drawn into the orbit of Remy Leclerc, the illusionist whose performances blurred the line between art and alchemy. What began as a romance soon soured into rivalry, for Remy was a man obsessed with control, unwilling to share either the stage or his secrets. When Evelyn betrayed his most sacred illusion to a rival theatre, it led to Leclerc's ruin. Felix had nothing to do with it, she said, her voice raw. He was a boy then, reckless, yes, but innocent of my sins. And yet, Holmes interjected, when your family's name became poison in Paris, it was Felix who paid the price, fleeing to London to escape Leclerc's wrath. Evelyn nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. He called himself the silent executioner, Holmes continued, not merely to invoke fear, but to remind you, every time you read the name, that your betrayal had condemned Felix to a punishment of silence and exile. The room fell still, save for the crackling of the fire. This, Holmes said softly, is not justice. It is a performance, a revenge played out on a family stage, with an audience of none. Holmes paced the room, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his mind already weaving the final threads into a tapestry only he could yet see. The executioner's methods, he said, are not those of a common criminal. There is no gun, no knife, only the theatre of the invisible, a murder without touch, designed to leave not just fear, but a legend. Watson, still absorbing Evelyn's confession, shook his head. But why target Felix so theatrically? Surely a simpler revenge would suffice. Holmes smiled thinly. My dear Watson, you mistake the nature of vengeance when it falls into the hands of an artist. For Leclerc, this is not murder. It is a final performance, a closing act 20 years in the making. He turned to Evelyn. Your family ruined his name in Paris, so he means to destroy the Rathbone name in London, not merely by death, but by spectacle, a whispered scandal that will linger long after Felix is gone. Evelyn covered her mouth in horror. There is only one flaw, Holmes added. The executioner has underestimated the resilience of his audience, for you have hired Sherlock Holmes, and I have no intention of leaving this theatre until the final curtain falls. The confession complete, Evelyn departed in silence, leaving Holmes and me alone in the fading light of the evening. For a long time, Holmes said nothing, his gaze fixed upon a single coal in the fire, his mind far removed from Baker Street. You knew, I said quietly. You knew who he was the moment we passed him in the alley. Holmes's smile was almost imperceptible. I suspected, he corrected. But yes, I knew him long before tonight. He rose and crossed to his desk, opening a narrow drawer from which he extracted a folded letter, yellowed with age. It was one of my earliest cases, Watson, he said. A matter so delicate, I never troubled to record it for your chronicles. A theft, a betrayal, and a magician who preferred vengeance over justice. I believed I had seen the last of him. And yet, I said, here he is. Holmes replaced the letter carefully. Justice, my dear Watson, is a rational pursuit, he said. But revenge is theatrical, and no man was ever more devoted to the theatre of vengeance than Remy Leclerc. He turned back to me, his expression oddly wistful. The question now, Holmes said, is whether we close his theatre or allow him one final bow. The morning following Lady Evelyn's confession, I found Holmes in an unsettlingly cheerful mood, a state I have always regarded with apprehension, for it signalled either imminent brilliance or dangerous folly. He sat at the breakfast table, his fingers dancing across a map of London, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Watson, he said without looking up, we shall require Lady Evelyn's presence at the Obsidian Circle tonight. Her role will be purely ornamental, or so I shall tell her. I set down my teacup with more force than intended. Holmes, you cannot seriously intend to place her within arm's reach of this man, not after what we know. Precisely because of what we know, he replied. The executioner's performance requires an audience, and who better to occupy the front row than his original betrayer? And what role shall we play in this macabre theatre? Holmes finally looked up, his expression that of a man anticipating a particularly fine piece of music. We, my dear Watson, shall provide the curtain, the trapdoor, and the final applause. There was something more I knew, some element he was deliberately withholding. I had learned, after years at his side, that Holmes's most dangerous plans always contained a personal gamble, concealed until the very moment of execution. I could not help but wonder whether this time the gamble was his own life. The air within the obsidian circle was thicker than I remembered, though whether from tobacco smoke or the sheer weight of unspoken threats, I could not say. Lady Evelyn sat near the centre of the room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes darting toward every shadowed corner. I could not blame her. To bait the very man who had haunted her for decades required courage of a rare and desperate breed. Holmes stood apart, leaning casually against the bar, his gaze sweeping the room with predatory ease. He had dressed more formally than usual, as if intending to appear part of the establishment, though I suspected his purpose was to stand out precisely enough to attract attention. I do not like this, Holmes, I muttered, keeping my voice low. Evelyn is trembling like a leaf. That is entirely the point, he murmured back. A nervous target attracts a hunter far faster than a confident one. His eyes flickered to a table at the far edge of the room, where a small, hunched man nursed a glass of brandy. The man's posture was unremarkable, his face obscured by shadow. Yet Holmes's interest had fixed upon him instantly. "The curtain rises," Holmes whispered. "Now watch closely, Watson, for the next act shall be one for the history books." Holmes's eyes remained upon the hunched man, though to the casual observer, he appeared merely to be examining the contents of his glass. Without turning his head, Holmes raised his hand, the most imperceptible gesture, signaling me to observe. It was then that I noticed the tremor. The man's fingers, curled around his glass, quivered ever so slightly, though not from cold or intoxication. It was the tremor of a man whose nerves had once been steel, but had rusted with the passage of too many years and too much bitterness. "Observe the right hand, Watson," Holmes murmured. "The scar along the thumb, the result of a chemical burn, no doubt earned in the service of a failed illusion long ago." "Remy Leclerc," I whispered. "More accurately," said Holmes, "the silent executioner." The man raised his head, and for a fleeting moment his eyes met Holmes'. I cannot fully describe that glance. It was not fear, nor even hatred, but rather the gaze of a fellow performer, silently acknowledging that the final act was at hand. Holmes inclined his head the barest fraction, like a conductor acknowledging his lead violinist, and the executioner rose from his seat. "Stay close, Watson," Holmes said softly. "If this man has indeed perfected the art of killing without touch, we shall soon find out whether I am immune to art." I had always considered myself reasonably inured to Holmes's taste for the dramatic, but what followed tested my nerves beyond all measure. Holmes stepped forward, directly into the executioner's path, his posture unmistakably confrontational. The room, previously murmurous with private conversation, fell utterly silent, a silence so profound it felt almost orchestrated. "Leclerc," said Holmes, his voice soft enough that only those nearest could hear. 20 years, and you still prefer smoke and mirrors to honest conversation." The executioner's lip curled into something resembling a smile. His right hand moved, almost imperceptibly, a flick of the wrist, so practiced and elegant it could have been part of a card trick. Holmes took a deliberate step closer, his breath passing directly through the air where the invisible vapor had been released. For an instant, my heart stopped cold. For what man could stand so boldly in the face of instant death? Yet Holmes merely smiled, that same maddening, knowing smile, and exhaled calmly. The executioner's hand faltered, confusion flickering across his face. "I took the liberty," Holmes said, "of preparing my skin with a thin coating of camphor oil, rendering it quite impervious to your favorite trick. It was a method I first observed in certain snake charmers of Bengal, who found it useful against a rather more venomous species." The executioner's expression shifted from confusion to fury, and for the first time in all our acquaintance, I saw Holmes's gamble pay off before my eyes. Holmes turned to me with a look of quiet amusement. "You see, Watson," he said, "even the invisible has its weaknesses, once you know where to look." The room erupted into chaos, but Holmes stood unmoved, the master of the stage, exactly where he had planned to be. Holmes' smile deepened as he held out his hands, palms up, for all to see. There was no tremor, no sign of distress, not the faintest trace of the deadly vapor's effect. "A useful trick, is it not?" Holmes said lightly. "Camphor oil, an old magician's secret, applied thinly to the skin, creating a barrier which renders airborne toxins all but powerless." Leclerc's expression flickered between disbelief and fury. "Impossible," he muttered. "That vapor has killed men without preparation," Holmes interrupted smoothly. "Men who did not study their opponents quite so thoroughly. You forget, Monsieur Leclerc. When one hunts an illusionist, one must occasionally become the illusion." The club's patrons, who had watched this exchange in stunned silence, erupted into murmurs, but Holmes held up a hand for quiet. His gaze remained locked upon Leclerc's, the smile still faintly playing at his lips. "You see," he added, "while you were perfecting your invisible weapon, I took the liberty of perfecting its invisible countermeasure. Artistry, you might say, to match artistry." Leclerc's hands fell to his sides, defeated. The performance had ended, and Holmes, as always, had seized the final bow. I have often wondered what it is in Holmes's presence that compels even the most hardened criminals to confess their sins, as though his mere understanding of them robs them of the strength to resist. So it was with Leclerc. His shoulders sagged, the bravado stripped from him like old stage paint. "It was never Felix I wanted, you understand," he said hoarsely. "It was her, Evelyn, the woman who took everything from me and left me a ruin." He swallowed hard, fingers curling reflexively into fists. But Felix was convenient. The fool returned to London thinking Paris had forgotten him, never imagining I had followed every step. "And so," said Holmes, "you delivered the letter, staged the midnight encounter, and ensured Lady Evelyn herself would be the unwitting witness to her brother's disappearance." Leclerc gave a bitter laugh. He was supposed to confess to the scandal, to the betrayal, and then vanish, leaving Evelyn alone to drown in guilt and disgrace. "But Felix never confessed," I said. "No," Leclerc admitted. "He begged, not for his life, but for hers. I had expected cowardice, but I found," he faltered, "I found a man who, despite everything, still loved his sister." There was a silence, broken only by the crackle of the club's fire. "You see, Dr. Watson," said Holmes quietly, "a duel between illusionists is rarely about weapons. It is always about truths best left hidden." Leclerc said nothing more. The story had told itself. The door swung open, and Lady Evelyn stepped inside, summoned by Holmes' quiet instruction earlier. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she faced the man from her past. "I never meant," she began, but Leclerc silenced her with a bitter smile. "You never meant to get caught," he said softly. "That is all you never meant." Evelyn's gaze fell to the floor. "It was not Felix who betrayed me," Leclerc continued. "It was you, Evelyn. You stole my secrets and sold them to my rivals. You destroyed my reputation. And when the scandal came, you hid behind your brother like a shield." Evelyn opened her mouth to protest, but Holmes raised a hand. "There is little value in revisiting ancient grievances," he said. "The facts have spoken, and they are rarely kind to anyone." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "I was young," she whispered. "You were cruel," said Leclerc. It was not an accusation, merely a fact, delivered with the detached finality of a man who had rehearsed this confrontation in his mind for 20 bitter years. Holmes turned to me. "Revenge, Watson, is a performance whose audience is the man seeking it, and rarely does anyone else find it worth the ticket." "And now," said Holmes, "let us put to rest one final illusion." He crossed to the door, opening it with a flourish, and there, pale but very much alive, stood Felix Rathbone. There was a gasp from Evelyn, and even Leclerc took a half-step back, as though confronted by a ghost conjured from mist. "You see," Holmes continued, "the death you staged was a trick within a trick, one which Evelyn and Felix conceived long before you arrived." Felix stepped inside, shame evident upon his face. "We thought we could vanish before you ever reached us," he said. "We were wrong." Holmes gave a slight shrug. "A poor illusion, Watson, a child's sleight of hand, no match for a professional." Evelyn and Felix stood side by side, united at last in truth, however uncomfortable. "And thus," Holmes said, "the final curtain falls, though I suspect none of the players find much comfort in the applause." The door opened once more, this time admitting 2 plainclothes constables, whom Holmes had discreetly summoned before the evening's performance began. "Mr. Remy Leclerc," said Holmes, "known in this country as the Silent Executioner. I believe these gentlemen have a reservation for you at Her Majesty's pleasure." Leclerc offered no resistance. Whatever fire had driven him for 2 decades had burned itself out in that room. He extended his hands without protest, the cuffs snapping closed around his wrists. "Your crime," said Holmes, "was not the attempted murder. It was the lack of imagination. You believed Evelyn would stand by helplessly, and Felix would die conveniently, but you forgot the most critical element in any performance." Leclerc glanced at him. "The audience," said Holmes. "And tonight, the audience included me." The constables led him away, leaving only silence behind. Holmes lit his pipe, the first cloud of smoke curling through the air like a ghost leaving the room. "Watson," he said, "if ever you write this case down, be kind enough to remind your readers that revenge is rarely worth the price of admission." The fire at Baker Street burned low, its embers casting a faint crimson glow upon the hearth, while Holmes reclined in his armchair, pipe in hand, his expression one of deep and tranquil satisfaction. I had seen that expression before. It was the face of a man who had solved the puzzle entirely and now invited his audience to admire the completed picture. "Watson," he began, "let us walk together, step by step, from the very first knock upon our door." I leaned forward, notebook at the ready, though I knew from experience that I would never capture it all. Holmes's mind moved faster than my pen. Lady Evelyn arrives, her hands gloved, her cloak damp, her face bearing the distinct pallor of guilt thinly veiled by urgency. Before she speaks a word, her perfume betrays her, a scent I had last encountered in the dressing rooms of Le Théâtre des Illusions in Paris. "And from that alone you knew." "I suspected," said Holmes. "The rest followed, as dominoes follow the first nudge. The letter, the missing brother, the staged murder, all theatrics, Watson. And who better to stage such a scene than an illusionist long thought vanished?" He exhaled a thin stream of smoke, the very image of satisfaction. "The moment Evelyn Rathbone entered our sitting room," Holmes said, "she ceased to be merely a client. She became a character upon a stage, one neither of us could yet see in full." Holmes leaned forward, tapping his pipe against the ashtray. "Do you recall, Watson, when we examined Felix Rathbone's writing desk? You observed the scattered salt upon the surface and dismissed it as a careless spill." I nodded, somewhat sheepishly. "Careless indeed," said Holmes, "but not from Evelyn's servants. The salt clung beneath Felix's fingernails, a most curious detail for a man who resided firmly inland." "But you said nothing at the time," I protested. "Because, my dear fellow, I was not yet certain whether Felix had fled or had been made to disappear." He struck a match, relighting his pipe with a moment's pause. "Sea salt, Watson. Felix had clearly planned a maritime escape, arranging passage well before the executioner ever stepped foot in London. That alone told me the Rathbones were not merely victims. They were players, rehearsing their own vanishing act." I shook my head. "You see everything, Holmes." "No," he corrected with a thin smile. "I see only what others prefer to ignore." Holmes stretched out a hand and retrieved a small envelope from the mantel. With deliberate care, he removed the faded photograph, the very one concealed in Felix's desk, and held it between 2 fingers. "The hidden photograph," he said, "was the single most revealing clue in the entire case." "How so?" I asked. "Because it revealed not merely Felix's past, but Evelyn's own. Observe the woman's pose, theatrical, almost exaggerated, the posture of a woman accustomed to adoration upon the stage." I studied the image again, and even I could see it now, the unmistakable air of a performer, not a debutante. "Lady Evelyn," said Holmes, "was not merely a socialite swept up in her brother's scandal. She was herself the scandal's architect, long before Felix ever knew the name Leclerc." "But Evelyn claimed ignorance," I said. "Because denial," said Holmes, "is the illusion we cast upon ourselves. To admit her betrayal would mean accepting that every misfortune her family endured stemmed not from Felix's folly, but from her own ambition." He returned the photograph to the envelope. Every case, Watson, is ultimately a study of human vanity. This photograph, hidden away yet never destroyed, is the very portrait of a conscience half buried. Holmes rose and crossed to the windowsill, where the faintest trace of Lady Evelyn's perfume still lingered in the drapes. "Do you recall, Watson," he said, "that curious scent when she first entered our rooms? A perfume both delicate and distinct, jasmine with a trace of absinthe." "Yes," I said, "you remarked upon it at once. Because it is a fragrance known only to the inner circle of Le Théâtre des Illusions," Holmes explained. "Each leading lady was gifted a vial, a symbol of her place upon that peculiar stage. When Evelyn returned to London, she brought more than memories. She carried the scent of her own undoing." I marvelled at the simplicity of the deduction, and at my own failure to perceive it. "Perfume," Holmes said, "is the most honest of clues. It speaks of where one has been, and where one's heart still resides." He turned back toward me, his smile softened by something almost resembling pity. Evelyn Rathbone had hoped to conceal her past beneath gloves and reputation. But no glove can mask the truth that lingers in the air itself. Holmes leaned back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, the glow of the fire catching the sharp angle of his cheekbones. "Now, Watson," he said, "let us turn to the matter of the weapon itself, a device as theatrical as its creator." I listened intently as he described it, a small cylinder, no larger than a watch case, concealed within the cuff of Leclerc's sleeve. A gentle flick of the wrist triggered a near-silent release of pressurized vapor, a mist so fine it vanished into the air almost before it appeared. "And the poison?" I asked. "Derived from the venom sac of the golden tree frog, combined with a trace compound known only to practitioners of certain chemical theatrics popular in Parisian cabarets." Holmes paused, his expression unreadable. "A poison that kills without trace, leaving neither wound nor residue, a murder by absence rather than presence." I shuddered. "A devilish invention." "An elegant one," Holmes corrected. And it was the very elegance of the method that confirmed Leclerc's identity. The silent executioner was not merely a killer. He was an artist, determined that his work would be remembered not for its brutality, but for its ingenuity. There was admiration in Holmes's tone, though tempered, I noticed, by something colder, a flicker of personal unease. "It is a curious thing, Watson," he added quietly, "how often the tools of genius fall into the hands least worthy to wield them." It was rare to see Holmes hesitate in his explanations, but when I pressed him further on the nature of the toxin, his gaze drifted, just briefly, to the bookshelf above his desk. "Some years ago," he began, "I published a small monograph, nothing of consequence, a chemist's indulgence really, on rare poisons of exotic origin and the conditions necessary for their atmospheric suspension." I felt a chill creeping over me. "You mean to say—" "I mean to say," Holmes interrupted, "that Leclerc's formula was not entirely his own. He merely borrowed the principles." I was speechless. Holmes gave a thin smile, devoid of humour. "You see, Watson, the desire for knowledge is a curious affliction. One cannot predict whether the fruits of one's labour will nourish a cure or feed a crime." It was the closest I had ever heard Holmes come to self-reproach, and I scarcely knew how to respond. "Do not look so alarmed," he said, with an attempt at levity. "The scientist who discovers gunpowder cannot be held responsible for every war." "Perhaps not," I said, "but it must sit uneasily all the same." Holmes waved the thought aside, but his eyes, I noticed, lingered once more on that monograph, as though it too had become a silent executioner in its own right. As the fire crackled softly and the case wound toward its quiet end, I found my thoughts circling a curious notion, one I voiced aloud after some hesitation. "Holmes," I said, "it occurs to me that the executioner, for all his venom and theatricality, may not have truly killed Felix and Evelyn Rathbone." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Explain, Watson." "It seems to me," I continued, That the true executioner was not the man in the mask, but the guilt Evelyn and Felix carried long before Leclerc ever returned. They were prisoners of their own past, haunted not by a spectre in the fog, but by the weight of secrets buried beneath society's polite surface. Holmes's smile was faint, but approving. "Very good, Watson. You edge perilously close to philosophy." "It is no philosophy," I insisted. "It is observation." They were sentenced not by Leclerc, but by themselves. He was merely the hand that signed the final warrant. Holmes regarded me with quiet amusement. "You have a poet's sentimentality," he said, "but I do not entirely disagree. A man's greatest executioner is often his own conscience." For once, we were in accord. Though Holmes's tone made it clear he preferred deductions to moral reflections. It was near midnight when I rose to take my leave, but something in Holmes's manner gave me pause. His fingers drummed lightly upon the mantelpiece, his gaze distant, as though seeing something I could not. "Holmes," I said cautiously, "is something troubling you?" He gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "Only this, Watson. What separates myself from Leclerc?" I stared. "What possible comparison?" "Consider," he said. "Leclerc pursued knowledge with ruthless intent, seeking mastery over illusion and death alike. Do I not pursue knowledge with equal fervour?" "But for justice," I objected. "For truth." Holmes's smile was thin. "Truth," he murmured, "is a convenient mask. The pursuit itself, the need to know everything, to see what others miss, that, my dear Watson, is a hunger without conscience." I wished to protest, but the doubt lingered in his expression, a rare glimpse behind the armour of brilliance. "Good night, Watson," he said quietly. Let us hope I never cross that line. As I walked home through the mist-laden streets, my mind returned again and again to Holmes's final words, "The price of genius." I had always marvelled at his gifts, his ability to see past illusion into truth, but I had never fully considered the cost. To see so clearly is to be forever apart, estranged from ordinary men. There was admiration, yes, but there was also fear. Holmes's brilliance was a blade so sharp it cut both ways, solving crimes while slowly severing him from the very humanity he sought to defend. And yet, I knew no man more worthy of admiration, or more at risk of his own gifts. That night, as I wrote my notes by the dim light of my study, I added a final line I would never show Holmes himself. Genius solves mysteries, but it is the heart that carries the weight of what is found. In the silence, I could almost hear his voice, sharp, amused, dismissing my sentiment with a quip. But in my heart, I knew the truth. Even Sherlock Holmes, the greatest detective of our age, was not immune to the weight of his own brilliance. It was near midnight when Holmes and I resumed our familiar places by the fire at 221B Baker Street, the case now concluded, though its shadow still clung to the room like a lingering draught. Holmes sat with his long legs stretched toward the hearth, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed in that peculiar state of alert repose I knew so well. For my part, I found the silence curiously unsettling. Ordinarily, the closing of a case brought with it a sense of resolution, a neatness, however imperfect, that allowed me to set down my pen with some satisfaction. But this time the air was heavier, the moral weight of what we had uncovered pressing uncomfortably upon me. Holmes, of course, betrayed no such discomfort. To him, the puzzle had been solved, the performance complete, and whether the players found peace after the curtain fell was no longer his concern. "Holmes," I said at last, "do you consider justice to have been served in this affair?" He opened one eye. "Justice, Watson. A rather slippery concept, wouldn't you say?" I pressed on. "Felix Rathbone has fled into obscurity. Lady Evelyn's name is ruined, and Leclerc, though apprehended, remains defiant and unrepentant. Where, in all that, lies justice?" Holmes gave a faint smile, devoid of warmth. If you are asking whether this case will satisfy your moral appetite, I fear you will remain hungry. And you, I asked, what does it leave you with? He stretched languidly. The truth, Watson, and nothing more. Justice is a concern for magistrates and poets. The detective's trade deals solely in fact. I sighed. It was the answer I had expected, but not the one I had hoped for. Holmes had illuminated the darkness, but the cold light of truth offered no comfort. You see, Holmes continued, our task is not to restore moral order. It is merely to strip away illusion until the truth stands, naked and unadorned. But truth, I argued, is only half the battle. What of the people left to live with it? Holmes shrugged. That, my dear Watson, is their affair. The surgeon does not concern himself with how the patient will walk after the leg is amputated. His duty ends with the removal of the infection. It was an analogy I found uncomfortably apt, for the Rathbone affair had indeed felt like a surgical dissection. Secrets laid bare with Holmes's scalpel-sharp deductions, until nothing remained but a mess of nerves and guilt. I reveal the truth, Holmes concluded. Whether it heals or harms is not my concern. I wished I could argue the point, but we both knew, in Holmes's world, truth was the only currency that mattered. Later, as Holmes retired to his room, I remained by the fire, my notebook open upon my knee. The story I had to tell was not one of neat endings or triumphant justice. It was messy, morally tangled, and unsettling in its truth. Would the public, I wondered, tolerate such ambiguity? Or would they demand the comforting lie of fictional symmetry? Villains punished, victims redeemed, all tied up with a clean, reassuring bow. I tapped my pen against the paper, uncertain whether my duty was to the facts or to the reader's craving for order. As I sat, lost in thought, Holmes's voice floated from the doorway, dry and unmistakably amused. Do stop wrestling with your conscience, Watson, he said. You will injure it beyond repair. I was merely considering how best to frame the narrative, I replied. Frame it however you like, said Holmes, so long as you remember this. Human folly, my dear Watson, is the only case that will never close. He disappeared into his room, leaving me alone with that thought, a parting epigram that was at once dismissive and profound. For all Holmes's brilliance, for all his unmatched skill in stripping lies bare, he understood one truth he rarely spoke aloud. Mysteries may be solved, but human nature remains incurable. And so, I wrote those words at the top of my notes, resolving to let the story stand, as messy, tangled, and true as the world itself. Holmes stood at the window, the London fog curling against the glass like a restless spirit. He had not spoken for some minutes, leaving me to the silence and my unfinished notes. At last, without turning, he said, Watson, do you know the most curious thing about this case? I glanced up. That the murderer was, in fact, an artist of death rather than a brute. He shook his head. Number it is that everyone involved, the victim, the villain, even the so-called innocent, was both hunter and hunted, guilty and betrayed, in equal measure. The crime was committed years before the first letter arrived. All we did was arrive in time to watch the curtain fall on a tragedy already written. Then what was our role? I asked. Holmes turned at last, his expression unreadable. To reveal the truth, my dear Watson, and to remind the world that secrets rarely remain buried for long. In the end, it is not the poison that kills, but the lies that give it purpose. Before we close this case, I leave one final question for you to solve. What do you believe was the silent executioner's greatest mistake? Was it the crime itself, or the confidence that no one could see through the illusion? Share your deductions in the comments below. After all, even the keenest detectives can miss the smallest clue. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery with Sherlock Holmes and me, make sure to subscribe for more untold cases, share this story with fellow mystery lovers, and join our circle of detectives by leaving your own theories below. The next case is always just a foggy knock at the door away. So stay tuned, for the game is always afoot.